Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Just doing a bit of work here on a 5-speed gearbox. I've got 3 of them to build at the minute. I have to take a rest from them every once in a while. But this is the input shaft. It's out of an R65. It's being built for a guy who is on a bit of a limited budget, and I've had to make some judgment calls about what we need to replace and what we don't. Now, the bike's not ridden hard. It's a commuter. It's been a commuter for a long time, and he doesn't have a lot of money to spare, so we're trying to give him a hand as best we can. It means using some components that are worn, not necessarily worn out, but worn, and that judgment is the one that I'm making to try and give him what he needs to commute on the bike. But I thought I'd show you how these things work. Now, this is the input shaft. There is only one gear on the input shaft, and that input shaft gear is either a 15 or 17.5 degree helical gear, and it drives the intermediate shaft helical gear, which in fact is the gear that drives the entire gearbox. It has 3 helical gears laid out across the front of the box in a triangular shape. There's the input shaft that you're looking at, there's the intermediate shaft, and then there's the output shaft, which actually is driven by 5th gear, believe it or not, through the final drive. In other places it's driven by fixed sliding dogs on splines on the intermediate shaft mainly. So the intermediate shaft's the one that does all the work, and for a very long time you couldn't buy any gears for the intermediate shaft. You could only actually buy the entire shaft, which is a very expensive little exercise indeed. There isn't a lot to it when you first look at it, but there actually is a lot. This sleeve here is the inside sleeve of a cylindrical roller bearing that goes in the front of the gearbox. This spline goes up into the clutch plate, and it in fact introduces the drive to the gearbox through that gear there. Now, it also is what they call a push drive gear. And how does it work? Well, you can sort of see there that you've got on this end here, you've got a cam, and then you've got the reverse of it on the side and a very stiff spring down here. And what actually happens is this gear here, if that wasn't held in place by the cam, it would just spin freely. There's no spline in there. There is a spline in here. It goes onto this spline that runs right up through the center of the shaft here, and the drive is pushed through to the gearbox via this this cog. But the reason that all this is here is because the way people wrap the throttles on and wrap them off and chop down gears and do stuff like that, if it didn't have that push drive in the gearbox, the whole thing would fly to bits in about 5 minutes. This big spring allows this cam to run up and around and push itself up against this, push this down and increase the compression on the spring, which in turn increases the force against the side of this cam. Now, these both wear out. These ones are in fairly good condition considering what the shaft there looks like. I just can't get another shaft for him at a sensible price at the moment, so we're going to use that one in the short term, and I'll be happy to fix it up for him later if we need to. But there are other things on here. So that's the push drive, that's the main drive. This plate here is a splash plate. Now, this bearing here is on the back of the gearbox, and what you got is a top hat bush here to step out the shaft. This is a splash plate to stop oil from going through the input bearing. It's there to stop a great quantity of oil getting through that bearing and out into the input shaft end where the clutch rod goes in. Otherwise it would overpower the seal that is there. And when you look at this end of it, there's 3 parts to this. The very inside bit is a very small, rather expensive little neoprene seal. It has a tin end on it, and it's pressed into the inside of the top hat and rests up against the end of this shaft. The clutch rod goes through there, and the bearing pack that goes in front of the gear or the clutch throwout lever goes on the end of that push rod, which goes in there. These are seal bearings. There are holes at the front which can be drain holes and can also let oil in. You would be amazed at how much oil gets out of the tiniest area in a gearbox. Try one tiny crack in a rear housing gasket and see how much oil can get out of there. These little slots here are for a second snap ring. There's a snap ring holding this whole mechanism together here. It is in front of this little collet, and they have a second one here to hold the gear that drives a kickstart if one happens to be fitted. So there's a simple looking shaft that does a tremendous amount of work. That little gear drives everything that comes out the back wheel of your bike through that cush drive. And incidentally, in the tail shaft of all the later model bikes, there's another exactly the same thing. There's a bell that goes onto the spline in your final drive, and another bigger cush drive than this. So your gearbox is effectively spring-loaded, cushioned from either end. And still people manage to destroy them by doing clutchless shifts and snap-on, snap-off throttles all the time. These gears get so horribly worn that they start to jam up. Anyway, that's just a little drive around an input shaft in a 5-speed gearbox. I hope you find that of some interest in these boring, dull, self-isolating times. Please stay well and ride safely if you do ride, and we will meet again in the not too distant future.